Great Yarmouth. A Victorian-style seaside town with mixed reviews in the modern day. As you walk down the streets of Great Yarmouth, you will be forgiven for thinking that it appears rather run down, out of date, and in desperate need of improvement. Well, hopefully this documentary will help you understand the history of the seaside town as I unravel its medieval origins and delve even deeper into its rich history spanning over 2,000 years. To lay the foundations of Great Yarmouth's history, we will turn the pages back even further to 10,000 BC. During this time, the Norfolk coast did not exist. Instead, the area was connected to Scandinavia by a low-lying landmass called Doggerland. This was a countryside filled with trees, meadows and rivers, and populated by a plethora of herding animals such as deer, woolly rhinos, bison and mammoths. A cataclysmic event occurred where large sections of ice sheets broke away from Scandinavia and caused a monumental tsunami which covered the entirety of Doggerland and raised the sea level in the area. This is now the North Sea. Remnants of Doggerland can still be seen today, as proven by Norfolk's vast sandbanks and peaty waters along the coast, which is a direct result of vast amounts of vegetation being broken down and released into the water. Much of East Anglia's flat countryside was also covered by this tidal wave event, which acted as a reset button for most of the indigenous hunter-gatherer population who lived as nomads in the local area. It is not until a few thousand years later that we begin to see the evidence of permanent settlement occurring around Norfolk, with the construction of mining industry at Grimes Graves near Thetford, henge sites around Arminghall and Hunstanton, and funerary barrows popping up all over the countryside. Indeed, in the late 1990s, excavation work revealed evidence of post halls and earth ditches in various places where Great Yarmouth stands today, mostly on the north side of town en route to Bacton. However, despite these scars in the ground clearly showing proof of Neolithic settlement in the area, a severe lack of contemporary finds mean that we cannot learn much about the indigenous people living in what was to become Great Yarmouth. I will now give you a few moments to write a comment about how Neolithic people appear to still be living in Great Yarmouth in the year 2024. Skipping forward considerably from the Neolithic period, and the introduction of the Romans in 43 AD, which is when Great Yarmouth as we know it today truly begins to take shape. Here we see some very solid remains of the Roman occupation of Britain, surviving for over 1,800 years. The foundationary remains of Caister-on-Sea Roman fort stands on the north side of the Waveney estuary, a collective name for where four rivers, the River Ant, Waveney, Yare and the Bure, meet at a confluence flowing into the North Sea. Erected in around 200 AD, Caister was the first of three confirmed shore forts built along the East Anglian coastline by the Romans. While only a small corner section can be seen today, Caister used to be a very large and imposing fortress, defending the estuary from raiding parties from mainland Europe. The Waveney estuary was the best entrance into East Anglia, and merchant ships would sail down the rivers Yare, Wensum and the Taes to reach the Roman regional capital of Venta Icenorum, now more commonly known as Caister St Edmunds or Venta Icenorum. Venta Icenorum was a large Roman market town built in around 62 AD, after the quashed Iceni or Iceni rebellion. And this Roman town was built long before the Saxon settlement of Norwich ever came into being. The town was fortified by large stone walls with towers, gatehouses and earth ditches to protect it from any possible future rebellions. Back then, the rivers were much larger and deeper than they are today, capable of carrying large merchant and military ships inland. Due to the ever-increasing prosperity and importance of Venta Icenorum, the construction of Caister Fort began around 140 years later. At the time, the fort occupied a small island within the Waveney estuary, and it is thought that the primary use of the defending soldiers was to quickly board their warships and deter opportunist raiders, fighting them at sea if required, on very short notice. This quick emergency response was made possible by a series of lighthouses and beacons, built and manned by the Romans all along the Norfolk coast. The site of one beacon is still possible to view atop the cliffs of Beeston Regis, neighbouring Sheringham. Further northwest along the coast, a second shore fort was erected shortly after the completion of Caister. This new fortification was named Branodunum, nowadays known as Brancaster, and was generally regarded to be less defensive than its southeastern counterpart. It is thought that Branodunum was considered to be more of a fortified harbour and stables, as opposed to a fully garrisoned military fort. By 260 AD, a third Roman fort was under construction. This would become the best surviving Roman fort in all of England. Its name, Gariononum. Armed to the teeth with tall stone walls and reinforced bastions, steep earth ditches and fortified gatehouses, Gariononum was the most formidable out of the 3 Roman shore forts that protected East Anglia. This fort was placed on the southern side of the estuary and, just like Caister, it resided directly over the water, with a dock fully catered to the harbouring of Roman warships such as trireme. For over a century, these 3 Roman shore forts defended the people of East Anglia, whilst also accepting tolls for merchant ships making their way into the regional waterways. The stone walls provided safety for trading goods, and this, as far as we know, was the first sign of Norfolk's prosperous trade networks that would prove incredibly fruitful throughout the next millennia. During the 4th century, the Roman Empire had become considerably under strain, with a string of unsuccessful emperors, corruption and rebellion wreaking havoc on the status quo. And in 409 AD, Rome officially revoked its rule of Britain. The military abandoned the island and sailed back to mainland Europe, where it was required to quash several rebellions and to aid in a civil war which had split the empire in 2. The remaining Romano-British were left to fend for themselves, having to deal with fractured trade links, a lack of capable tradesmen, and no military protection. For around 50 years prior to this, the shore forts had already been struggling to fend off the ever more confident Saxon raiders. In 367 AD, many Roman shore forts became overrun by a semi-coordinated attack by the Saxons, the Picts and the Scots. The lost control of the fortresses meant that enemy reinforcements were free to sail into the estuaries unchecked and wreak havoc on the nearby settlements. It is not known with utmost certainty if the Saxon raiders did indeed arrive on the British shores with violence in mind, as there is a severe lack of evidence to confirm that an all-out invasion by these European mainlanders took place. Instead, it is now more commonly thought that this was a mass migration of people, perhaps seeking out a more peaceful land to start a new life in, considering that the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe meant that lands were being carved up by local warlords. By the beginning of the 5th century, it becomes clear that the Roman shore forts of Caister, Branodunum and Gariononum were no longer functional. Much of the stone and timber that made up the fortifications and the barracks within the walls were being taken for local farmsteads by the local villagers. The lighthouses were no longer manned and the beacons no longer lit. This period of history, which lacks the organised order of Roman rule, has become widely known as the Dark Age. The term Dark Age is now considered to be fairly outdated and misrepresentative of this particularly interesting period of history in Britain. The Romans, in their heyday, often kept records of most aspects of daily life. Records that can be translated and offer a key insight into how they ruled the people of Britain. After the Roman military left the British shores, however, this administrative network also collapsed. With a severe lack of structured records to follow, it becomes much harder for us to understand what Britain was truly like from the 5th century onwards. However, the arrival of the Saxons did allow one specific trait to flourish. Originally, the Saxons followed local pagan beliefs, steeped in folklore and with personal interpretations of the pagan gods changing between tribes. These beliefs, however, only lasted for a few hundred years once they arrived in Britain, possibly due to the Saxon people beginning to settle amongst the already Christianised Romano-British, and began learning more of the Christian culture and religion. By the 6th century, the Saxons began to convert to Christianity, also following the ways of their mainland European counterparts who were now also converting all over the land. Christianity brought with it education, better trade rights, reading and writing, and possibly a more peaceful lifestyle. By the 9th century, we see many Christian places of worship spring up all over Norfolk. At this time they were mainly quiet chapels, humble in size, but some were already beginning to benefit from the prosperity that the Norfolk countryside had to offer, like the Benedictine Abbey of St Benet's near Ranworth, and more were destined to follow. Not only that, but the Saxons would give us the first seaside settlement which would become the Great Yarmouth as we know it today. With all these monasteries popping up all over the marshes of the Waveney estuary, they needed a central trading hub to export and sell all the commodities they were making, such as wool, peat, textiles and illuminations. On a spit of land sandwiched between the Waveney estuary and the North Sea, with the ruins of Caister to the north and Gariononum to the south, Yarmouth first came into being. Prior to the Saxon migration, Roman settlements nestled themselves along the boundaries of the Roman shore forts. These Roman domestic settlements were called vicus. It is believed that the first Saxon settlements along this section of coast occurred long after the Roman buildings had fallen into ruin, as there is no mention of immediate Saxons settling in the area after the fall of the Roman Empire. These hamlets took the form of small fishing communities, hugging the beach, and, over the following centuries, began to expand and envelop each other into a centralised large town. By the 11th century, we begin to attribute the first official name to this settlement, Yarmouth, although there were now a swathe of similar ports being constructed all along the East Anglian coastline, such as Cromer, Galston, Lowestoft and Dunwich. Yarmouth stood head and shoulders above the rest, acting as the primary trading harbour for the central trading hub of Norfolk, Norwich. As there were smaller settlements around Yarmouth at the time, the town was given the title Magna, meaning Great. Great Yarmouth. By this time, Norwich was also not actually a single town, but 3 neighbouring boroughs which would eventually amalgamate into one giant settlement, destined to become the new regional capital now that Wenta Icenorum had largely been left to ruin for the last 500 years. A new era was taking form in East Anglia, the age of the wool trade. By the early 11th century, Norfolk had established itself as a powerful trading region. Largely thanks to its abundance of agriculturally rich soils, the flatness of the land and the rich diversity of waterways which made transport particularly easy, not to mention its close proximity to mainland Europe, East Anglia was beginning to shoot ahead as the most prosperous region of England. It was the wool trade in particular that brought in vast riches for East Anglia. The plethora of Christian monasteries were all hard at work cultivating sheep for their wool to process and transport to the nearest trading harbour, destined to be shipped all over Europe from the Norfolk ports. Great Yarmouth received extensive profits from tolls, not only from merchants using the harbour to load and unload their stock, but also to use the 4 rivers that made up the Waveney estuary to travel inland towards Norwich, hence using the harbour to load and unload their stock, but also to use the 4 rivers that made up the Waveney estuary to travel inland towards Norwich, which by now had a thriving market at Tomb Land. The prosperity of Great Yarmouth during the Saxon period was largely unmatched by any other Saxon port in England, and, unbeknownst to the locals, would become a very real problem. Since the late 8th century, the Saxon kingdoms of England had been under near constant harassment from raiders from the Norselands. The Vikings were a formidable force, and had been targeting monastic sites along the Northumberland coast, with the most famous example being the successful raid of Lindisfarne Priory in 793 AD. Ever since, the Vikings continued to be an ongoing threat to Saxon England, encroaching ever more inland as more and more longships arrived along the shore. The various Saxon kingdoms had locked horns with the Vikings for 200 years in near constant aggression, seeing more and more land fall to Nordic rule. East Anglia fell to the Vikings following the Battle of Hoxne in Suffolk in around 870 AD. The Danish leader Ivar the Boneless claimed victory over the slain King Edmund of East Anglia, and proceeded to demolish the Saxon monastery at Ely, along with many other religious sites throughout East Anglia. By the beginning of the 10th century, East Anglia was firmly in the hands of the Vikings, who made Thetford their main settlement, an already fortified area consisting of large Iron Age earthworks built by the Iceni almost 1,000 years earlier. Over the 10th century, swathes of England fell to the Vikings, and this occupation went largely unchallenged until a new Saxon king by the name of Alfred the Great managed to get several independent Saxon kingdoms to join forces in order to beat back the invading Vikings. It appears that the Vikings were rather fond of East Anglia in particular, not bothering to return home with stolen riches, but instead deciding to set up home in this new, somewhat tranquil land. This angered the Nordic king Sweyn Forkbeard considerably, who, in 1002 AD, launched a fleet of Viking longships directly to East Anglia, where they came ashore along the sandy beaches of Yarmouth. The Vikings proceeded to torch the town, razing it to the ground in a fiery inferno, slaughtering both the local Saxon and Viking population, teaching the residential Norsemen a lesson for failing to bring back looted riches to their true homeland. Forkbeard, not content with the complete destruction of Yarmouth, decided to make one more stop before heading back to his Nordic throne. He decided to sail up the Yare River, navigating it to the River Wensum, which led ships straight into the heart of Norwich. By the end of Forkbeard's rage-induced flurry into East Anglia, he had successfully razed both the entirety of Norwich and Yarmouth to the ground. By 1010 AD, reconstruction began on both settlements, attempting to not only restore them to their former glory, but with the intention to develop them into the largest trading towns ever seen within the region. Learning from past events, both towns were built with defence in mind. Large-scale earthworks were dug around the circumference of Norwich, complete with palisade walls, bridges and gatehouses to fortify the settlement. Yarmouth also featured earth ditches, protecting the areas not already strategically protected by the Waveney estuary. Over the following handful of decades, Viking Norfolk began to re-establish itself as a trading powerhouse, with more monasteries and merchant harbours than ever before. Sweyn Forkbeard evidently gave up attempting to punish his disbanding population, as it is believed that the 11th century held host to a mass migration of Scandinavian people, all flocking to East Anglia for its prosperous trade links and nutritionally rich soils. Indeed, many Viking settlements begin to spring up during this time, many of which acted as satellite trading hubs specifically for Yarmouth. In fact, the Saxons had essentially been kicked out of East Anglia, as the Vikings had built up a triangle of settlements along the waters of East Anglian fenlands. Hemsby, Scratby, Ormsby, Mortby, Herringby, Stokesby, Rollsbury, Clipsby and Billicksby were all Viking settlements that guarded the great River Bure and the tributaries that flowed into it. Meanwhile, inland, Norwich was steadily growing in both size and economy, taking over its Roman predecessor as the new major market town of East Anglia. Both Saxon and Viking churches began to pop up all over the town, each acting as a central hub for various communities. The Scandinavian population was largely situated in a settlement named Norwich over the Water, on the northern bank of the River Wensum. Back in the 11th century, a complex of bridges connected the two neighbouring boroughs via islands in the middle of the river. And despite their tumultuous past, the Vikings and Saxons appeared to live somewhat peacefully together in Norfolk, caring much more for trade and profits than warfare. For over 200 years, the Saxon and Viking population lived together and integrated themselves within each other's cultures, with Christianity and trade being the two main pillars of their coexistence. Elsewhere, wars and rivalry had been a near-constant struggle across England, but East Anglia was known to be a largely peaceful region. By the mid-11th century, the Saxons were holding steadfast and had been pushing the Vikings out of their homeland with a newfound success under the military leadership of Harold Godwinson. In 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge proved to be the final main conflict between the Saxons and Vikings, and with the Saxon victory that followed, the Viking army was finally uprooted from England, with their leader, Harald Hardrada, sailing back to Scandinavia. This was not a mass exodus of the Viking population, however. The majority of Nordic people stayed as they enjoyed their new lifestyles of trade and agriculture, with the landscape of England providing everything that they needed. This status quo was to be challenged again just a few weeks after the Saxon victory at Stamford Bridge, as a bigger threat was looming from the south. Norman ships from Normandy, northern France, had just arrived on the shores near Pevensey, Sussex, and the Norman army was marching inland, eager for conflict. The Saxons met them in a field, which would later become the centre of a town called Battle, and they would inevitably be defeated by the Norman invaders, who were under the leadership of William the Conqueror. Following the victory, which would become known as the Battle of Hastings, the Norman invaders from the south were free to march north through Kent and to London, where they were largely uncontested as the Saxon military had now been broken. By Christmas of 1066, William was crowned king at Westminster and became the first Norman king of England. But what exactly did this mean for Great Yarmouth? What we do know is the Normans revamped the tolls and taxes of all ports in England, giving out royal charters to several larger and more influential ports over the 12th and 13th centuries. This provided ports with the opportunity to set their own tolls and taxes in order to reap more benefits where suited. Great Yarmouth was granted the Royal Charter in 1208, and evidently became an even more prosperous port and trading place from this moment onwards. During the 13th century, the town saw multiple giant construction projects which drastically altered the skyline of Yarmouth. 3 monastic houses were developed, namely Whitefriars occupying the northern end of town. Unfortunately, Whitefriars is now gone, but the parish church of St Nicholas survives today and is one of the biggest parish churches in all of England. Greyfriars was situated in the centre of town, in amongst the medieval merchant houses, of which only a small portion of the cloister and corridor survives as a ruin hidden between modern buildings today. And then there was Blackfriars, which was a large friary of the Dominican order, in a walled enclosure on the southern side of town. Each of these fine churches would have had a cluster of monastic houses surrounding each of them, such as tithe barns, storerooms, kitchens, dormitories, infirmaries, chapter houses, stables, and more. The friaries would serve the local community by offering schooling, medical care, housing the homeless and the sick, as well as raising money to build bridges, maintain roads, and providing accommodation for pilgrims. The monastic houses would have also had their own retinue of monks who would work within the precinct and the local area to provide everything they needed to be self-sufficient, having access to large swathes of local farmland and riverways. Having at least 3 substantial monastic orders all housed within the town of Great Yarmouth would have brought in a lot of income just by themselves, and we know that many other smaller religious houses were also present in Yarmouth at the time, either within or just outside the settlement. By 1260, King Henry III had granted Yarmouth with a licence to build the town walls, evidently deeming it necessary to protect such a valuable settlement that was increasingly bringing in vast sums of money from the various tolls and taxes it was charging sailors and merchants who harboured there. The townsfolk had to fund these walls themselves, so each person was tasked to collecting building materials such as timber and flint, in order to gather everything they needed required to build such a large construction project. By 1289, the construction of the walls was started, with the estuary providing a natural defence in the west. The walls were only built on the eastern side of town, no doubt with the monks of the 3 monastic houses also assisting in the construction of the walls around their immediate precinct boundaries. The town walls are fascinating as, while being made of flint just like the medieval walls of nearby Norwich, these walls were not faced with stone as Norwich's would have been. Instead, they were finished in a high quality knapped flint, where the stones are cut to have a flat edge on one side, almost giving a polished look. This was an attempt to make the walls look professionally made and presentable without the use of facing stone, since that material was simply not available in the local area. There are famously no stone quarries in Norfolk, and importing high-quality stone and the work required to face it themselves would have been far too expensive and time-consuming, so the walls were instead left in a beautiful but locally built knapped flint facade. Also note the round towers, which are made entirely of flint. Round towers were generally a much later medieval style used primarily to protect from cannon fire, as the curved wall would make a direct shot from a cannon less likely and help absorb the impact. However, towers made of flint with no heavy stone facade would not provide much protection against cannon fire. And indeed, cannon at this time was still only in their most primitive and experimental stages of evolution, meaning that the threat of cannon fire was not the reason why these town walls were built this way. It is, again, a way around the requirement for importing expensive stone to complete the construction project. Square towers require large cornerstones to ensure that the tower is structurally secure, so building round towers was the only way to keep the tower secure without the requirement of importing stone. In the 13th century, the town also oversaw the construction of one other particularly intriguing project which unfortunately has been lost to time. For about 400 years, there was a castle here at Great Yarmouth. Situated between King Street and the aptly named Tower Hill, on site of the Brunswick Hotel, stood a large stone keep. Records from the 13th century and onwards confirm that this keep featured 4 towers, possibly resembling a smaller version of Rochester Castle, and the location of this castle was perfect. By the 14th century, Whitefriars to the north, Greyfriars in the middle and Blackfriars to the south would have all featured their own fortifications, complete with walls, towers and gatehouses protecting their precincts. The friary churches themselves would have boasted tall stone belfry towers which allowed the skyline of Yarmouth to be seen from miles away by sailors out at sea. So, with the 3 church towers, plus more smaller churches dotted around the town, the flint walls and round towers and the large stone keep dominating the skyline, Great Yarmouth would have looked like an imposing fortified settlement to any hypothetical invading force. And indeed it is understood that Great Yarmouth never came under direct siege during the entirety of its lifetime as a medieval port. The location of this castle is also important due to its proximity with the merchants' quarters. Just across the street sits the toll house, an early medieval building for collection of tolls, with records dating back to the 12th century, although the building we see today is largely from the 13th and 15th centuries, with a lot of repair work done post-World War II. The imposing fortified keep would have been ever present in the eyes of the sailors and merchants walking to the toll house to pay their due taxes, acting as a reminder of law and order and a detriment for not obeying the rules set out by the town's royal charter. Just north of the toll house is the trading area, known as Merchants' Row, where multiple medieval merchants' halls and market streets would have been situated, continuously loading and unloading goods onto ships, which would have been undoubtedly a very busy place to be. Again, the castle would have been a continuous reminder of law and order. Indeed, we know that in Norwich, the Normans moved the trading square from Tome Land, which was in use by the Saxons, to where the current market is today, which was purposefully located due to being in the shadow of Norwich Castle. Barely any records have survived regarding Great Yarmouth Castle, so little is known about it. We do know that it was largely used as a prison, and already in a semi-ruinous state by the early 16th century. By the beginning of the 17th century, it was demolished and gone forever. By the late 13th century, the town saw great success from several income streams. The monastic houses were hard at work, queues outside the toll house from foreign captains awaiting to pay their shipping taxes, and fishing boats coming back to harbour with their hulls filled with fresh herring. Thanks to this, Great Yarmouth had grown to become the 6th largest town in all of England. The people of Great Yarmouth wouldn't know this at the time, but they were enjoying the town in its heyday, its pinnacle of prosperity. As, when we turn the page to the 14th century, the town would gradually fall into a steady and unrepentant decline. The beginning of the 14th century continued much the same as the previous 100 years. thriving trade, busy ports, and a continuous stream of ships constantly entering and exiting the port. But cracks were beginning to show. The town was having difficult relations with London, the main buyer of Yarmouth's herring supply. These tensions possibly came into being due to Great Yarmouth increasing the cost of herring, as the town was in near constant competition with herring fishermen from Flanders just across the North Sea. This caused King Edward III to introduce the Statute of Herrings, in an attempt to keep the cost down for the English people. However, this was not properly enforced, and did little to de-escalate the disagreements over trade. In the early days of the 100 Years' War, the English Navy began mobilising warships that were being docked in the quayside of Great Yarmouth, and this lack of English naval defence directly led to an increase in attacks by the Flemish Navy just off the coast, which in turn caused a decreased yield from fishing ships and also meant that some merchant ships were forced to divert to safer ports elsewhere. Not that the larger merchant ships could dock in Great Yarmouth at this time anyway, as by 1337 the effects of longshore drift and coastal erosion was causing the harbour entrance to silt up and become unusable. Several attempts were made to dig out the entrance, but for the first time, the people of Great Yarmouth, and indeed Norfolk in general, were battling something far greater than they could ever comprehend. No less than 7 new harbour entrances, named havens, were dug, depicting a 200-year struggle to keep the harbour alive, with the final haven being dug in 1567. This was not a nightmare reserved just for the population of Yarmouth, however. Orford, Dunwich, and many more ports along the East Anglian coast had also silted up due to the effects of longshore drift and relentless coastal erosion. Indeed, the medieval city of Dunwich and the coastal town of Shipton, just north of Cromer, fell into the sea entirely as a result of coastal erosion, accelerated by harsh storms and the soily sandy cliffs which could not survive in a constant battering from the North Sea waves. The Black Death came to Norfolk in 1348, and by 1349, over half of Great Yarmouth's citizens were dead. The population of around 5,000 people were effectively trapped inside the town. The stone walls to the east and the quayside to the west meant that the people of Great Yarmouth were hemmed into a small area, and the success of the previous century meant that the houses were all huddled in very close proximity to each other, further accentuating the spreadability of the plague. For the approximately 2,500 that survived, they left their homes to find that roughly a third of the population of England had been killed, equating to around 2.5 million people. There was no one to continue digging the havens, no one to man the ships, and no one to sell or buy the herring. This inevitably caused a Great Depression throughout Great Yarmouth and across the country of England. For the following 700 years, things would only continue to get worse. The constant battering of financial hardships from the 1300s onwards were really beginning to take hold of Great Yarmouth by the 16th century. In 1545, the Duke of Norfolk carried out a survey on the fortifications of the town and found that the walls had been neglected to ruin, with sand dunes butting up against the walls and, at some points, burying the walls entirely and rendering them useless. By decree of King Henry VIII, the Duke of Norfolk set the people of Great Yarmouth to work to dig out the ramparts and clear the dunes from the walls, also removing several makeshift houses that had been haphazardly built up against the fortifications. The pride and spirit of the townsfolk evidently shone through, as the Duke reported that the citizens had done an expert job in clearing the earthworks and rebuilding the fortifications, with the Duke of Norfolk even sending an official letter of thanks to the people of Great Yarmouth. Some resurgence of trade after a haven was successfully dug in the 1560s allowed the town to enjoy a limited amount of success, but nature proved to be relentless and the 7th haven began to silt up once again. This time the larger merchant ships were being diverted either 100 miles north to the newly industrialised harbour of Hull or Felixstowe to the south. This was unfortunately the way of things for the next few hundred years, and digging of the havens became too expensive for the people of Great Yarmouth, who had now been plunged into severe financial depression. The industrial revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries also took a toll on the town. At the same time as Great Yarmouth was investing in modernising its quayside with a revamped haven, new bridges and many factories along the estuary, Norfolk in general was experiencing a mass exodus as people were beginning to flock to the various heavily industrialised cities around England, such as Liverpool, Nottingham, Birmingham and Sheffield, with a curiously large proportion of Norfolk's population moving to Manchester. The Victorian period held host to the popularisation of seaside holidays, and Great Yarmouth proved to be a favourable destination, likely due to its new railways, favourable flat ground and extensive white sandy beaches. The promenade became awash with hotels, amusements, coaches and horses, and theatres. This seasonal trade carried on for the next 100 years, right into the early 20th century, and it appeared that Great Yarmouth was getting its mojo back. During World War I, the first German Zeppelin raids were sent from Hamburg, destined for the Humber River. Bad weather took the airships off course, and instead the Germans dropped bombs on the secondary target, Norfolk. 2 airships flew over Norfolk, the L3 and the L4. The L3 flew over Haysborough, and began dropping bombs over Great Yarmouth, instantly killing 2 civilians, Samuel Smith and Martha Taylor, who lived on St. Peter's Plain. The L4 was destined for King's Lynn, bombing several coastal settlements across Norfolk on its way, including Brancaster and Heacham. It is believed that the bombing were intended to target the industrial quarters of East Anglia, but poor visibility and bad weather meant that mostly civilian areas were hit, causing much fear and lowered morale for the British. On the 3rd of September 1939, Neville Chamberlain delivered a speech that would shock the country. War was again declared. This would become the Second World War. World War II, however, would prove to be a different beast to World War I entirely. By 1940, Great Yarmouth had become a key embarkation point for the British and Allied troops, as well as being responsible for minesweeping in the local waters, keeping the shipping lane safe against enemy mines. In the summer of 1940, the first bombing raids were carried out. The night sky filled with the eerie drone from the Luftwaffe, and the town was subjected to extreme punishment from both high explosive and incendiary bombs. Much devastation was caused by the German bombers, with large swathes of quayside being completely destroyed, turned into a fiery inferno. Within a year, over 800 bombs were dropped on Great Yarmouth, and much of the town was demolished. Even long after the war, the turmoil caused by the Luftwaffe continued, in the form of a survey on train lines of Norfolk, carried out by Dr. Beeching. Beeching was tasked with revamping the rail network, and, seeing how underpopulated much of East Anglia was, and how derelict most of the once prosperous seaside towns had become, he began to uproot much of the regional railways that connected various smaller settlements around Norfolk. This made it harder for holiday goers to reach Yarmouth, and as such meant that the town could not fund any form of major reconstruction projects to modernise itself after the ravages of the Second World War. And that is unfortunately the end of the line in terms of discussing the history of Great Yarmouth. As we disembark from our journey, we look back down the tracks from where we've come, and reminisce over the town's once great status within England. A thriving harbour, a religious powerhouse, and a culturally rich town with much influence over the region. Today, Great Yarmouth is a shadow of its former self, but hopefully, with the help of my documentary, we can walk the promenade, play crazy golf, and think back proudly to a time when Great Yarmouth truly earned its name. But for now, thanks for watching.